Here is a story from a prayer meeting one summertime back in the good old days. It was sent to me by Dorothy Peterson, who remembers when Judy made her way up the sawdust trail to the strains of Just As I Am. Judy walked slowly into the Fruitvale Community Church that special morning in the summer of 1946 as the congregation was singing Just As I Am. It was an old, familiar hymn that Judy heard almost every Sunday morning. She lived near the church, just walking distance, and decided she would like to visit the place of worship, where Just As I Am was sung every week. She knew the minister's family, and the opportunity was just right for her visit. The doors of the little church were left open because it was a hot day in Fruitvale, California, 10 miles north of Bakersfield. Judy walked slowly up the middle aisle and paused at each row until she recognized the minister's wife, seated in the front row of the church. She continued to proudly walk up to the front of the church and then sat herself next to the minister's wife, who smiled with a faint expression of embarrassment. Judy held her head high and, wearing her only coat, set her dignified tail down and looked up at the minister. The minister, viewing the humor unfolding before his eyes, kept leading the congregation in Just As I Am. My brother Marvin and I were choir members, and watching Judy sit there, looking at the song-leading minister, we tried to stifle giggles and laughter. That laughter got much louder when the minister started laughing himself, pausing only to catch his breath as he sang, Just As I Am. In another second, laughter caused the minister's new dentures to explode into orbit, out of his mouth and over the pulpit. His maneuvers as he tried to catch his teeth, and Judy trying to catch a visit to church, made for a day I will always remember. Judy, you see, was our beloved dog. The minister and his wife were Papa and Mama. Our home was directly behind the church. Someone left our gate open, and Judy walked right into church. The hymn, Just As I Am, must have made my dad feel the real truth of the song when he lost his new dentures and a strange four-footed friend came to church. Sometimes I would sing Just As I Am while washing the dishes. Judy would sit and listen and wag her tail as I cleaned off the plates. I wonder if the hymn brought back memories of her visit to church, or if she was just hungry. Judy was a special pet. There were lots of them back in the good old days. Denise Pomeraning remembers when she and her sister gave their dog, Mopsy, a much-needed bath. Now you would think Mopsy would appreciate the cleansing. Instead of that, all the bath gave him was hurt feelings.
We never intended to hurt his feelings. When my sister June and I were growing up, we were fond and proud of Mopsy, our dog, with long white hair that fell in tangles across his bright eyes. Keeping Mopsy well groomed was a pleasure because he enjoyed being brushed and combed and even bathed. This was a switch from our other dog, Skippy, who hid under the bed whenever bath was mentioned. June and I brought up Skippy's dreaded subject one day after the dogs had been playing in the dust. Skippy made a quick getaway, but Mopsy obediently followed us into the basement. I ran upstairs and helped myself to Mother's best lily-of-the-valley soap, while June filled 2 adjacent tubs with water, one for washing, one for rinsing. The washing went smoothly. We lathered Mopsy, being careful to keep the soap suds out of his eyes. As his body was placed carefully into the rinse water, we noticed a bottle of bluing on a shelf above us. We knew all about bluing. It got rid of something called tattletale gray, which was a well-known curse to housewives who wanted dazzling white sheets and pillowcases. Our mother used it in the family laundry every wash day, and we had just recently overheard that bluing was the secret of our grandmother's beautiful white hair. I looked at June. June looked at me. Our minds clicked as one. Why not use it on Mopsy? If there were directions on the bottle, I didn't read them. Half the bottle of bluing went into the water. Splash! We rinsed off the Lily of the Valley soap, put a towel around Mopsy, lifted him from the tub, and placed him on the floor. We stood back to admire a dazzling white dog. Instead, we gasped in horror. Mopsy had turned brilliant blue. For a moment we stood in shocked silence. Then we burst into laughter at the sight. It wasn't comical for Mopsy, though, because no amount of towel rubbing would take out the color. Our own hands and fingernails were blue for a day or two as well. Poor Mopsy was stared at as some kind of freak in the neighborhood for weeks afterward. Definitely, Mother told us, we had given him a bluing overdose. Skippy probably had plenty to say to Mopsy as well. Next time a bath is mentioned, head for cover, pal.
Some work animals became almost pets to us farm kids. Nell was not only a retired workhorse and an out-to-pasture family pet. She also served a very important function in a large farm family. As Frank Groves relates, Nell was a babysitter.
It was about 1904, and old Nell had been retired from farm work because of age, but she hadn't retired from being a useful friend and companion. Her retirement turned out to be a blessing for my parents, especially for my mother, because Nell became our babysitter. Living on a Missouri farm in the early 1900s with 5 small children and long hours of work inside and outside the home left my mother with little extra time. Then we discovered that old Nell loved children. She'd always been a hard-working horse, and she'd always allowed us to ride on her back. Now she was ready to give long hours to keep the little ones amused. I was around 10 and the oldest. The youngest brother was still in diapers, but even he was allowed to participate in the fun. I'd go out to the barn and bring old Nell around to the house. I'd pull her head down toward the ground by holding her forelock. She'd stand with her neck bent, and I'd ease the first child onto her head. She'd slowly raise her head, and the child would slide down to her back. I'd pull her forelock again and let the next child slide down. So it went until my sister and 3 brothers were on the horse's back. Then Nell would walk around and around, back and forth, entertaining the children. Sometimes I'd join them and ride too, but often I'd play by myself or do my allotted chores. If one of the kids would fall off, old Nell would stop and stand completely still until I went through the ritual of replacing him on her back. Nell was absolutely the best babysitter anyone could ever wish for. It's a joy to think back and remember those times on that Missouri farm.
Mama wasn't intending to bring home a goat from the auction, either as a pet or as a barnyard addition. She even warned the kids to keep their hands down so the auctioneer wouldn't confuse a scratched head as a bid. But as Toni Szallar remembers, the end of the auction was the beginning of a friendship between Mama and the goat.
I shall never forget my first auction. It was Memorial Day, and I was 12 years old. My parents planned to go to the auction and then on to a picnic with friends who owned a farm nearby. John and Dad had not only been boyhood friends, John had also been Dad's best man, so when John bought a farm, Dad was overjoyed. Mama spent the major portion of the 20-minute drive lecturing my younger brother, sister, and me from the front seat. I don't want you children to move when you're at the auction. Don't scratch your head or rub your nose. If you do, the auctioneer will think you're bidding. Keep your hands down and sit still. We arrived at the farm just as John and his children, Cammy, Bert, short for Alberta, and Pete, were loading into the back of their pickup truck the crates of eggs John hoped to sell at the auction. Mama carried the bowl of potato salad and hot dogs that were our contribution to the picnic up the brick walk to the white farmhouse. Chuck, my little brother, and I climbed into the back of the truck with our friends. My sister Judy, still a toddler, would follow with Mama and Dad in our car. The hot steel bed of the truck burned our shorts-covered bottoms and bare legs while the wind blew our hair into our eyes. But we didn't care. We laughed and held on to the sides of the truck as we bounced up and down. It wasn't long before John drove into the parking lot of the auction barn. The 5 of us scrambled like ants over the sides of the truck, eager to see everything at once. Our parents had given us permission to investigate the pens behind the barn where the animals were caged until their turn in the auction ring. We didn't know where to look first. Ponies and calves beckoned to be petted. Pigs grunted and snorted. Sheep, kittens, and puppies urged us to touch them while the chickens cackled. The auctioneer was closing the bidding on the last crate of chickens when we joined our parents. I was fascinated by the way the wooden seats formed a semicircle above the sawdust-covered ring. The auctioneer sat on a raised wooden platform below us. Goats were being led into the ring, nannies of all colors and sizes, brown, black and brown, tan and white. Then there she was, white as snow and just a few weeks old. One old farmer started bidding on the tiny goat. Mama handed Judy to Dad. Her hand was waving like a flag flapping in the wind. The other bidders quickly fell by the wayside as the selling price climbed higher and higher. All, that is, but Mama and the old farmer. Dad just shook his head. Sold once, sold twice, sold to the woman in the 3rd row. Pay for your goat at the office, lady, before you pick it up. Chuck and I were jumping up and down, thumping each other on the back in excitement. Mama had bought us a new pet. We named her Snowflake as we rode back to the farm. Cammy, Bert, Pete, Chuck, and I were too busy trying to feed Snowflake flowers and bits of grass to bother with eating our own picnic dinner. Later, as we drove home with Snowflake in the back seat of our car, Dad teased Mama. "Remember, kids, don't move. Seems to me like you warned the wrong ones." "Charles," Mama said, "I just couldn't let him buy that precious baby. He looked like an old billy goat himself." The funniest part of the day, however, was when we were stopped by a red light at an intersection on the 4-lane highway. A long black limousine driven by a chauffeur pulled to a stop beside our car. Sitting proudly in the back seat was a well-groomed matron, with her chin resting in boredom on her white-gloved hand. She glanced over at us with haughty disdain. Snowflake chose that moment to stand up and pop her head out of the open window. "Bah!" she bleated at the limousine's passenger. The lady's disdain turned to astonishment as we laughingly drove away.
How could we talk about pets and not talk about cats? Most of us had a favorite cat, and many could relate to Tom. He was aloof, disdainful, and altogether maddening. He also had at least a few of those legendary 9 lives that cats are supposed to be endowed with. I'm sure you'll be able to relate with this recollection of Tom the Cool.
My recollection of pertinent data may be somewhat strained, because I was only 4 years old at the time, but I do recall Tom. Tom, as you may have already surmised, was a cat. Tom being a very unimaginative appellation, I don't really know who named him, nor do I really care. The tale I have to tell is far more dashing than is indicated by such a forlorn endearment. By any standards, Tom was your average, everyday, run-of-the-mill looking cat. There was, however, a certain expression in those eyes that made one think, "Cat, you're not telling all, are you?" Tom let you know nothing. Coochie-coos and kitty-kitties were real turn-offs for Tom, and my picking him up by his tail seemed to arouse an even more potent disdain. Still, Tom and I knew where we stood. I was the kid, and he was the bon vivant Lothario of the neighborhood. Neither the sexiest of felines nor the mangiest of canines kept Tom from his appointed rounds. As sure as the first portion of the sun ducked beneath the western horizon, so would Tom's first eye pop open. The total immersion of the sun found the insatiable Tom cleaning up and going through some calisthenics, be it for Fifi or Fido. "Tom, why don't you stay inside and watch Uncle Milty with us?" my sister Joan would ask. Sardonically, he would stop dead in his tracks, turn for one patronizing glance as if he were doing us a favor for having given us his presence for the day. "Come on," he seemed to complain. "Open the door. I've got a neighborhood to tend to." Know something? We opened that door, and with a great deal of haste at that. 10 to the neighborhood, old Tom dead. The gals were like putty in his paws. Pretenders to this throne were savagely rebuffed. Drama and adventure followed Tom through the alleys of antiquity. If cats had a Times Herald, he'd make their headlines. Oh, he was a fine warrior. The end seemed to come about in July of 1956, on one sultry, sweaty night in our home in Memphis. Tom had said his good evenings, and my brothers and I had long since finished listening to the Cardinals on the radio. The huge three-bladed window fan droned a familiar summer song as it strained to cool those high ceilings. Suddenly there was a loud dang. My parents rushed in to see which of us 4 boys had fallen out of bed and walked through the window fan. To their relief and regret, they found a small mass of the remnants of a cat that was indeed Tom. "Should we bury him tonight?" my mother sobbed. "Nah," my dad fumed. "We'll give him a Christian funeral when the garbage men come tomorrow." And so they retired. When they returned the next morning, there was Tom licking himself, and though a little sore, prepping himself for his nocturnal duties that he would face that evening. "No way," my dad leered. "No way could you come out of that meat grinder alive." Tom sneered at my father and turned his head. Even at such an early stage of my life, I was curious about things like defying gravity or defying death as my cat had just done. So I waited for his entrance the next night. In the wee hours of the morning, I could see Tom bidding his nightly adieu to an adoring crowd. Then he strolled up to that giant windmill of a window fan. As if mesmerized and in sync, that cat and the fan became one in space and time. As blade by blade spun by, Tom's shoulders cocked a little tighter. His eyes became wider, and his nostrils flared. Suddenly, in one breathtaking instant, he shot through the microscopic opening between the blades without being touched. With later observations from inside the house, I concluded his landing was a cross between Pete Rose and Al Jolson, landing on one knee. Not a scratch, I say. Not one harmed hair. Barnum or Bailey would have bought a ticket to see this one. There are other stories about Tom, but this one stands out. This cat was an integral part of my adolescence. The neighborhood we both grew up in evoked a certain instinct for survival, and Tom surely was an example of that. As mysteriously as he lived, he disappeared. I know nothing of his whereabouts. You see, Tom decided one day to shuck the fan, and my dad, and us, and just sort of, well, walk away. Oh, he's still alive. Tom would never allow himself to die.
The wild animals and birds around a nearby lake were never pets for Alice Bisbee and her family, but they all certainly became friends. Minnesota had 10,000 of them, but Alice's fondest memories are of our lake.
We called it our lake because our farm skirted it on 2 sides. It was one of Minnesota's 10,000 lakes. In extent, it comprised about 100 acres with a marsh at either end. At the south end, a little stream connected it with the Watonwan River. The bed of the lake being 4 feet below that of the river. At times of flood in the river, it backed up, raising the lake several feet above its usual level. This fact saved the life of the lake in later years. To us kids, the lake was a constant delight and a place where we saw nature in all her moods. Each season brought distinct changes in the life within it and on it. Being a part of the flyway for migrating wildfowl, it became a haven for the weary travelers. Here they stopped a day or two to rest and feed. During these migrating seasons, we kids loved to sit on the shore and watch and listen to the activity on the lake. We learned to know the wild folk by their voices. There was the proot-proot of mud hens, the honk-honk of geese, the haunting, quavering cry of loons, the quack-quack of ducks, the walk-walk of cranes, the harsh chatter of a kingfisher from an overhanging tree nearby. But the most fun was to startle the hundreds of mud hens swimming on the open part of the lake. At a clap of our hands, they would all take off for the opposite shore where they hid in the bulrushes. Mud hens do not fly when startled, but run on top of the water, leaving a double row of little fountains beneath their flying feet. Hundreds of these little feet pattering on the water made the old lake simply roar with a sound like thunder. When migrating time in the spring was over and the big flocks had gone on, some birds stayed behind to nest on the lake. This was the time we kids liked best. In our boat, equipped with camera, we set out to tour the lake in search of nests to photograph. There were plenty of them. In the marshes, we found nests of mud hens, blackbirds, Virginia rails, marsh wrens, and many others. On a rotting muskrat house, we found the makeshift nest and eggs of a helldiver, a duck so called because it can stay under water so long. Then there were the fish nests in the shallow water along the sandy south shore. The fish who nested here were bullheads. The spawning parent fish would make a slight depression in the sandy bottom. In this, she would deposit her cluster of eggs, looking like a spoonful of tapioca. She stayed beside the nest, vibrating her tail to keep the water moving about the eggs. When she realized that she was being watched, she took a nosedive, thus muddying up the water so we could not see the nest. Sometimes we startled a great blue heron, quietly watching in the rushes for some helpless fish to come by. He would never fly, but instead he stretched his long, slim body, long neck, and just as long beak upward in a straight line, so to a casual observer he looked like the rushes among which he stood. He would remain motionless this way as long as we stayed there, his little sharp eyes fixed upon us all the time. Sometimes we tried to tire him out. No use. We always got tired first. Photographing mud turtles sunning themselves on a muskrat house proved our Waterloo. A dozen or more of them at a time were asleep on a rat house, looking like a lot of black pies set out to cool. What a fine picture they would make! But we discovered that the lowly turtle has very keen hearing. No matter how quietly we approached, even the rubbing of rushes against the side of the boat sent them sliding into the water. We focused the camera on the rat house and waited, thinking they would get used to the camera and come back. But no, it was getting near sundown. We decided to leave the camera focused on the rat house all night. To be sure we would not startle the turtles when they came back in the morning, if they did, we tied a fish line to the shutter and strung the rest of the line to a hiding place behind a clump of willows. Next morning, we crept noiselessly to the willow and pulled the line. A faint click came from the camera. "We've got 'em!" cried Brother as we scrambled into our boat. We paddled out to the rat house, now uncovered because the turtles had slithered into the water at the click of the shutter, and got the camera. Hurriedly we rushed home and developed the negative. Our hearts sank. It was blank. The dampness of the lake during the camera's long night vigil had swollen the leaves of the shutter so much that it would not open. The turtles had won again. That autumn the fall rains were unusually heavy. As a result, the river overflowed and backed up into our lake. Muskrats had completed their winter houses. In them, fall litters of kits had already been born. There were about 200 of these rat houses in both marshes. The unusual high water completely submerged them. All those little kits in them would surely drown. We set out in our boat to see what we could do to save them, but we need not have worried. The wise rat parents were equal to meet the emergency. They had built temporary rafts of bulrushes. In the middle of each raft was a cozy little bed made of grasses. In these beds cuddled the little brown babies. When the water subsided, the resourceful parents carried the babies back into their winter houses. We kids loved the old lake. In summertime, we swam in it, went nest hunting in its marshes. In winter, we skated upon it when the ice was smooth. When covered with snow, we put on our snowshoes and tramped across it to explore the great snowdrifts northwest winds always carved upon its far shore. That is the story of our lake as it used to be. Now all is changed. 4 big lakes, Laws, Hopkins, Fedge, and Emerson, all are gone. Draining all these lakes has brought another great change in our lake. It has forced migrating flocks of waterfowl to move their flyway further north, where there are more lakes and fewer farmers to drain them. Consequently, our lake has become a silent place. No longer do we hear the honk of migrating geese or the haunting cry of the loon. Farmers have turned lakes into cornfields. Of course, they now have more bushels of corn to feed and to sell, but I wonder if the loss of the lake is worth the gain of a few bushels of corn. I wonder if it pays to drain our lakes.